What is going on, YouTube? This is Acid Root. So I'm going to review the third album by rock band Panic at the Disco. Basically, this project is called Vices and Virtues, and it came out in the late winter of 2011. Now, the thing about this particular project is it's a departure from the Pretty Odd album from mid 2000. It's a departure from the Pretty Odd album from early 2008, and it's more similar to and this album is more similar to a Fever You Can't Sweat Out from late 2005. So it's a pretty good concept just because I think most folks probably wanted more music. I think most folks probably wanted more music like a Fever You Can't Sweat Out. Definitely that Baroque pop. Definitely that theatric Baroque pop type style fit the band pretty well in 2005 and definitely that theatric Baroque pop type style fit the band pretty well in 2005 and 2006. I'd have to say, and I think it was sorely missed on the Pretty Odd album. I'd have to say. Now that album was still pretty stellar. It did have some gems on there. I reviewed both those albums in early 2022, the first half of 2022, as far as that pitch kind of happened with it. But I took a break from reviewing this band. I wanted to get back to them just because apparently they're not going to be around as much anymore. They kind of pseudo retired in 2022. Hopefully they do wind up putting out more music, but I would have to say this is a pretty stellar album. I'd have to say it's a relatively brief album. They do have some bonus tracks on like the deluxe edition, but I noticed on like Amazon and iTunes and places like that it's not really readily available. So it's kind of interesting how to get like the 4 deluxe songs plus all the other ones. It's kind of a concept. There's not really a CD that has like the deluxe edition, so it's just kind of the concept of wondering how to get these particular songs. So I'm going to go ahead and review the 10 song edition that is on Spotify and that type of stuff. I would have to say this is actually a rather super stellar album here. It's not going to get a super rave score, but it's good enough to be able to say that it's a return to form of folks who do really thoroughly enjoy like the Fever You Can't Sweat Out album from 2005. It's definitely a pretty good pitch. There's some great stuff on here, even if it's not as much like a widespread smash as the Fever You Can't Sweat Out. There's definitely some excellent stuff on here that just has a lot of catchiness and overall feel. So this is basically just like a 2011 edition of like a Fever You Can't Sweat Out from 2005, which is a pretty dope concept. Just I don't know, it's just too bad that these singles didn't chart heavier. I would have wondered why these songs were just not quite as much of like an overall smash and just overall marketplace kind of smash like they were in 2005 and 2006. I mean, that album a Fever You Can't Sweat Out got to the 5th single and really dominated for over a year and a half, I'd have to suppose. It's just kind of the concept of just questioning as to why this band didn't do better as to the times that these particular times kind of happened with it. But I would have to say I reviewed another project that Panic at the Disco was kind of a part of. Back in October, I reviewed the Jennifer's Body soundtrack, which had a hit song from Panic at the Disco as one of the singles off that particular project. So I'd recommend checking that out. I do have a Panic at the Disco playlist, so you can see a number of projects I reviewed. This would be the 4th one of just their initial kind of affiliation, I'd have to say. So it's a pretty dope concept. To get a lot of these. But yeah, I would have to say a pretty hit album here. Definitely reminds me. I would say that this is probably a favorite album of mine. I would have to suppose. Really enjoyed this one. Just would have to say it was just a few songs shy of being like a full blown. It was just a few songs shy of being like a full blown classic. But then on top of that, it's just kind of a relatively short project, I'd have to say. But still a return to form, I'd have to suppose. And it's not like Pretty Odd was bad. It was just a different variation compared to the style that people were hungry for at the time. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the singles off this particular album. There were 3 of them, which is pretty dope to have kind of gotten, but I still feel like it was still relatively somewhat trite compared to their earlier heyday from 2006 2005 compared to their earlier heyday from 2006 2005, I'd have to say. But the first single is the Ballad of Mona Lisa. This is like a classic Panic at the Disco type feel. I'd have to say this is like some vintage kind of theatric Panic. I would definitely feel like Panic at the Disco as far as that pitch kind of happens. This is like a glimmering kind of night activity, I would suppose, and this would just be some typical kind of out on the town fun, I'd have to say. So it's pretty good concept. Definitely reminds me of like The Only Difference, and also, like the second single, like I Write Sins, Not Tragedy. Definitely reminds me of The Only Difference in the second single, I Write Sins, Not Tragedies, off of A Fever You Can't Sweat Out. Just the same sort of pitch that this particular kind of has. Just a little bit more of like a night sense, not quite as much of rambunctiousness towards it, a little bit more graceful, I had to say. A little bit more car appeal, just kind of stepping out to like a social venue, just some good flash, less kind of residential, more kind of just outing type fare, just within a sense of dressing up a little bit, looking a little bit snazzy as far as that pitch kind of happens. Keeps the theatric type feel, but it's just a little bit more graceful as the fair starts to mature and stuff like that, I suppose. But it's a dope concept. It's still vintage and classic Panic at the Disco. Just a great concept to get some of these. I'm glad that they're just back on their normal fanfare. As far as that pitch kind of happens with it. The second single, and it's also a pretty hooky song, I'd have to say. This is pretty hooky. They do have some great hooks on this particular project, so some good stuff that just gets them completely back to their fare. Just too bad that the reception for this project wasn't better. I'd have to say this did hit like 70 on the Billboard 100, the Ballad of Mona Lisa, but not, wasn't quite as full blown as they were in 2006, like I was saying, but still a dope concept. It's this vintage kind of Panic at the Disco. This is a return to form, I'd have to say. The second single is Ready to Go, Get Me Out of My Mind. This is another highlighted one. This is definitely kind of a jazzy outing dance stepper, I'd have to say. This has a good groove and appealing social middling about it that this song particularly kind of has the feel of just doing real well, I'd have to say. This is just some fun jive, I'd have to say, and it's a pretty hooky song. So this is another real hooky type one that just works pretty well. It just fits right in with like the EDM type sound of like 2011 as far as that pitch kind of happens, where it's not quite a the song is not necessarily like an EDM type song, but it does work pretty well as like some synth pop type stuff, I'd have to say. So it's a pretty dope concept to kind of get some of this. They translate pretty well to that particular type sound. So it's another highlighted hit from them as far as that pitch kind of happens with it. This is just a great 1-2 punch for some of the more social outing type fare and just overall jazzy kind of nightlife that just fits them quite well. Brendan Urie's it seemed like Brendan Urie had a pretty good sense of night appeal. So it's a pretty dope concept to get some of these just back in their typical fashion that they belonged in. It's just a great concept to kind of see some of these, I'd have to say. Let's Kill Tonight is another highlighted one. This is definitely a great third single. I'd have to say it's another hooky type one. I would feel like this is just some venue bounce. The song is just some venue bounce and some restaurant noise. I'd have to say this is just typical. I would say this song is typical Panic at the Disco, similar to the only difference from A Fever You Can't Sweat Out. Definitely, it's just a more jazzier song just within that pitch. So it's a little bit jazzier than some of those type songs from A Fever You Can't Sweat Out, but I still have to say it's a pretty nice one. This is just a good 1-2-3 type punch. I'd have to suppose all three of the singles really kick ass and are just a good night fare and just overall outing flash that just works pretty damn well. Just a great concept to get them in their typical kind of Baroque pop type feel, and they just overall have some more dance snaz to it that just works pretty well. So it's just some great concepts. If you do, like, you can't, with this particular project, you can't complain as much that they don't sound like their Fever You Can't Sweat Out type days, because they definitely knock out some of that theatric type sound. It's just a real return to form and just nails it pretty well. I'd have to suppose there's some more strengths that this band particularly kind of has, and I would also say that this album also delivers on like some of the album cuts. I remember that was one of my complaints in 2022 about A Fever You Can't Sweat Out, is just the fact that they didn't have as many album cuts as they did with like the singles. There were 5 singles, but the rest of the album was kind of somewhat subpar just within that sense. They do have some good album cuts on here, I'd have to say, but it's just a relatively brief. I do feel like there probably should have been a 4th single. I probably would have went with like Trade Mistakes. This is like another good pitch just to have kind of had for like another nice one to kind of have. It's just kind of the concept that it's just a relatively brief. I realized that this band only had 2 members at the particular time. The other 2 band members left before this album came out and before the Jennifer's Body song, I'd have to say. It was just kind of a concept. It's just too bad that there just wasn't more promotion for it, because I definitely feel like they hit a particular stride on here. They had more songs like the singles and just a little bit, maybe like a smaller, maybe just like a slight more bit strengths in like the song variety, I would have definitely said that this could have been like a full-blown classic. Just as, I mean, it's definitely as good as A Fever You Can't Sweat Out. It's just not quite as promotionally it's just not quite as promotionally successful, I'd have to suppose, but still a pretty dope album. Definitely just kind of more off to the wayside, but just not, I mean, that is still in like an emo sense. I would say in like an emo sense and an alternative sense, it's still a pretty shining winner, I'd have to suppose. So it's a pretty dope concept to get that particular one. So to talk about the 10 songs so talk about the songs I recommend on this particular album. Basically, I wound up recommending to you 7 songs out of 10 on here. So I'm going to go ahead and recommend those 7 songs. They would be The Ballad of Mona Lisa. So the 7 songs I recommend would be The Ballad of Mona Lisa, Ready to Go, Let's Kill the Night, Hurricane, Trade Mistakes, Nearly Witches, and Sarah Smiles. Basically, talk about some of these. Talk about the ones real quick that I don't recommend. Just basically some of these, like Memories, The Calendar, and Always. Some of these are just kind of more homely type songs that just didn't really nail the pitch that well. I definitely feel like the social quality of this particular album is at an all-time high. It's definitely one of their most social and just overall appealing albums, just in terms of the visceral type tone this project kind of has, just for like mingling, schmoozing, and that type of stuff, as far as like some outing type fare. I just kind of feel like some of these more makeshift type moments. I mean, I think the theatrical and Baroque pop type sense kind of works for like social type moments, but just in a more homely type sense and house cleaning type sense, it just doesn't really deliver. I feel like Always was kind of a bomb of a song, just kind of a dud that just didn't work. And the same thing with The Calendar. That one was kind of like a bleary kind of outing type song for just like appreciating the sight as far as that pitch kind of happened, but it just didn't really deliver quite as well as it needed to. And then Memories was just another poor one that just didn't really deliver quite as well, just in terms of like, I mean, that one was kind of a little bit more of a snappy song, but it just didn't really deliver quite as well as like Memories was trying to be more of like a power ballad type tune, but just didn't really pull it off quite as well as it probably needed to, as far as that pitch kind of happens. It was just kind of a chugging along kind of makeshift kind of car rumble. It just didn't deliver quite as well as it needed to. Some of these moments were just not quite as strong, I'd have to say. I definitely feel like some of these theatric type vibes, I know they couldn't have had like a full-blown album just like social appeal and stuff like that, but I don't know, I was kind of thinking that it needed like another song like But It's Better If You Do, something like that. Just one of those type songs. Just the single quality of like A Fever You Can't Sweat Out was just sorely missed on this particular project. It just felt a lot more snappy and to the point. It just didn't have like the song variety. I mean, has the album quality in terms of like the cuts on here, but it's just a lot, just more snappy, and it just didn't have. I feel like the promotion, the overall burst of energy that that particular album from 2005 kind of had was just a little bit catchier. Not to say, I mean, this album is pretty catchy in terms of like the impact. I mean, the songs on here are as good as like A Fever You Can't Sweat. It's just kind of the concept that the single variety is just not quite here as much. It's just kind of the concept with like in a milder sense with like the songwriting variety. But there are some ones like Hurricane is a pretty nice one. This is like a gleaming kind of night venue pizzazz of a song. I'd have to say this is like an outing accompaniment. I would definitely feel like this is like your loud pack for some outing fare. There's a good summer and spring and fall. And it's a good summer and spring and fall as far as some of that nightlife kind of particularly kind of happens. Just a good accompaniment. Just some of these initial songs that you hear, like the first three songs you hear on this particular album, and then the first three songs you hear on this particular album, and then Ready to Go are all some excellent ones for some great social nightlife. I'd have to say this is just some good quick times fun. This is just some good quick times fun. I'd have to say, and it's just a graceful kind of fraternizing music. I would feel like so. This is just some great fraternizing type tunes. Just some great stuff to kind of have for like some graceful sense. It just really keeps that kind of white collar type frou-frou type appeal that Panic at the Disco is kind of known for, and they work pretty well with it. It's just some white collar type music. Just really like the appeal of it. Just some real nice type stuff. Not necessarily bookstore type music, but just more in a graceful sense. Places like Starbucks and places like that, just in a more kind of elegant, just in a more elegant sort of sense. I'd have to say. Trade Mistakes is another highlighted one. Trade Mistakes is basically like a wary kind of Baroque pop ballad. I'd have to suppose pretty good concept to kind of get that particular one. This is like a theatric but stylish. This song is theatric but stylish, I'd have to say, and it works for more white collar type makeshift, I'd have to say. So this is kind of like a makeshift type one. This is a good example of some song variety on this particular project that wasn't on A Fever You Can't Sweat Out as far as that pitch kind of particularly happens with it. It's just a good concept to get that one in particular. This would have to say it's just a this is definitely like some wary kind of car music. I'd have to suppose one of those tearjerker type ones where you just kind of feel wary and stuff like that. And just the standard blear of makeshift malaise, just the sort of pitch. I mean, it's not. I mean, it's definitely kind of a moody and emo type song. I'd have to suppose, but it's just kind of within the concept of just some of that type, just within the typical type sense of being more baroque and theatric as far as that kind of happens with it. It's a good concept for that. And then Nearly Witches, Ever Since We Met is a pretty good highlight. This is like a jazzy kind of out on the town, similar to like Build God. I'd have to say the Build God scene. The Build God, Then We'll Talk single from A Fever You Can't Sweat Out. I would definitely have to suppose it's like a spicy kind of social flash. I would definitely have to say, and this is just a good quick times kind of highlight. I'd have to say, so it's a pretty highlighted one. Just reminds me of like some standard date night type fare, just out on the town, like an evening kind of sense. Just some typical kind of social appeal as far as that particular pitch kind of has with it. This is just some good kind of this really kind of feels like a hop and bop just within a city stepping type sense, and it's also pretty good for like some restaurant type music. There's a number of restaurant type songs, so I'm glad that Panic at the Disco got back to some of these restaurant type songs on this particular album because there's some good stuff to kind of have. It's just fitting for like some evening senses and just overall food outings and stuff like that. I'd have to say some good concepts. Sarah Smiles is another one for that sort of pitch. This is definitely like a stellar. The song is like a stellar kind of typical dance tune and restaurant jive. I'd have to say this is vintage Panic at the Disco. I would definitely feel like in the Baroque feel kind of gives it like a roundabout kind of hit. I'd have to say so. It's a pretty good concept. And the beginning of the song is more acoustic and kind of more laid back, and then the second verse it gets a little bit more jivey, a little bit more theatric and Baroque with it as far as that pitch kind of has. It's just a good concept to kind of see some of this typical kind of Fever You Can't Sweat Out type Panic at the Disco as far as that pitch kind of happens. It's a good concept. Definitely some restaurant type fare and just some overall outing. Just a good dance type song. I mean, there are some dance moments on here. I feel like songs like Sarah Smiles, a little bit of like Let's Kill the Night, a little bit of Let's Kill the Night, and a little bit of Ready to Go. Some of those type pitches just have some good overall appeal. Just some social outings just for like some dance club type music just within a jivey type sense. So it's a dope concept kind of get this particular project. Just it's a pretty good burst of energy. I definitely have to suppose for 2011 this is definitely pretty state of the art and just an overall appealing type project that definitely had its gleam and overall this pizzazz that just worked and jumped off the page and was a pretty immediate factor despite the fact that this album didn't really have like the same social pizzazz, despite the fact that this album didn't have the same commercial pizzazz that they had in 2006. But still some dope concepts. Don't sleep on this, I'd have to suppose. I know it's 13 years ago, but still a good concept to still fuck with this project and revisit it, I'd have to say. So in terms of what I'm going to score this album, me basically recommending 7 songs out of 10 on this particular album. I'm going to go ahead and give this album like a 7.75 out of 10. I feel like it just missed getting an 8. I mean, it's really kind of tough to score this album in particular just because it's so short. If you don't like a couple of songs, it kind of snatches it from getting like a 10 or a 9 or something like that. So it's just kind of the concept. The 3 songs I didn't recommend to snatch it from that sort of concept. I just felt like the song variety on here was just not quite as good when it wasn't in like the social aspect and some stuff like that. They just needed a few more social type hits to kind of have in a different sense when the energy's turned down and stuff like that. There's just not a ton of often moments. I mean, they nail it on Trade Mistakes, but not many moments besides that, I'd have to suppose. That's kind of the concept. The social score, though, I'm going to go ahead and give a 9.5 out of 10. I would almost get the social score. I'm going to go ahead and give like a 9.5 out of 10. I would almost give it like a 10 out of 10 if it just would have had like another single and just maybe like a couple more songs that could have had some hit potential as far as that pitch kind of happens with it. But it's definitely pretty close. This is just full of outing type fare and just overall social pizzazz. Great little jive album to kind of have for some loud pack and stuff like that. Great for Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night. Some pitches like great for Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, some of those type pitches. Just some great weekend type fare and overall dance pizzazz that it has on here, and just some restaurant type fare also. Just some good loud pack for like that weekend kind of nightlife and just overall kind of evening sense as far as those pitches kind of happens. Just a great concept, just pretty much on par with the Fever. You can't sweat out, just the same kind of burst of energy, just a little bit less casual and commercial, I'd have to suppose. That's kind of the concept about it. In terms of the future, that's difficult because supposedly Panic at the Disco is broken up, which is pretty unfortunate, I'd have to suppose, but maybe they'll come back eventually at some stage, I'd have to say. But it's just a good concept to kind of get this. This is another return to form for Panic at the Disco. Definitely some highlight type stuff. It's one of their best albums, I would definitely, I'd suppose. It's a real social and impactful type one that just has a lot of flair towards it. So I would recommend it quite a bit.